There are a lot of sci-fi out there that have the theme of space battles. Star Trek for one, Star Wars definitely, Starship Troopers certainly. But most are about the war, not so much about the warrior. Sure, they focus on the people in the war, perhaps one or two or three specific people, but there's not really much that's done to really get into the nitty-gritty of that person's inner workings. This is not the case with Armor by John Steakley. Like Starship Troopers, it takes place on a planet filled with bugs that they're trying to kill, but has a lot more focus on the characters themselves than on the war or on the politics of the war. Armor follows two characters. One is the soldier Felix, and the other is the pirate John Crow. The novel is in 4 acts, and for this particular video we're just going to go with Act 1, which is where Felix takes the stage. Felix is a greenhorn just out of basic training, and is on a starship on his way to his first drop. Most of the greenhorns begin with the warrior power armor, which is bigger, more powerful, bulky, tends to protect a lot more. And it has built-in firepower along with the assigned rifles. Felix, however, was made a scout. The scout armor is much lighter, much faster. It does not have the built-in firepower and only has the rifle for protection. Because of this, the armor is usually given to veterans of war, since the casualty rating is a lot higher. Yet, they made him a lousy scout anyway. So the starship makes it to the planet. They drop onto the planet, right in the middle of a swarm of ants. Their word for, the Starship Troopers' bugs. Not surprisingly, all in Felix's unit, except for Felix, get killed. He eventually finds other units and learns that communications with the starship have been cut off. And now they are simply playing for time against the swarms and swarms of ants. Kind of like the hordes of bugs in Starship Troopers, only much, much worse. So far, my reaction to the book has been that it's been very good, it's very enjoyable. I've had a lot of difficulty putting it down. The world building in it is actually kind of how I prefer most world building to be. The book doesn't over-explain things or over-describe things. Instead, it lets the reader kind of imagine what things look like for the most part, and discover the world through the character's eyes as the character interacts with it. The side characters are interesting enough. They're mostly just there for the main character to learn more about the world, and thus the reader to learn more about the world. But the author makes it fairly obvious that most of the characters aren't terribly important to the main character. Felix himself has an inner monologue that is very dry, very snarky, and the author manages to make him very relatable and sympathetic. He's not your, go-get-em type warrior. He's just a dude that is in power armor. The writing style is fairly different from what I'm used to. Steakley tends to use language and the flow of his sentences to portray the character's feelings and the urgency of a situation, and allows the reader to actually feel the same just based on how it's written, instead of using a lot of description. In fact, I will show you by reading you a bit myself. It was then, for Felix, it began. The hatred for the briefing officer had expanded to include his superiors, the captain of the ship, the commanders of fleet itself, and finally the thick-headed idiot humans who had undertaken something as asinine as interplanetary war in the first place. The hatred blazed brightly, then vanished. From somewhere inside came then a shock of all-consuming rage, the Nova-like intensity of which startled even him. But then the rage was gone too. It seemed to shoot away like a comet or a torch dropped flickering and shrinking into a bottomless well. What replaced the loathing and fury was something very different, something cold and distant and only impersonally attentive. It was an odd being which rose from Felix and through him. It was, in fact, a remarkable creature. It was a wartime creature and a surviving creature, a killing creature. From a distant place, the frightened Felix scanned himself. He recognized little. Still, what he saw was a comfort of sorts, and he concentrated himself toward it, toward the coldness, the callous, machine-like. The engine, he thought. It's not me. It's my engine. It will work when I cannot. It will examine and determine and choose and, at last, act. It will do all this while I cower inside. With furious concentration, that which kept him Felix gave itself as fuel to that which could keep him alive. There was more to the briefing, more figures of time and distance, more numbers of men and probabilities of enemy. The engine heard and made note. Felix, watching himself, feeling himself, psyching himself, felt disgust at all that was about to happen, and all who had caused it. And once more felt the distance between himself and those about him. Again, as he briefly scanned their armored forms filling the chamber, he thought, "They're all going to die." Felix fired and fired, the blue beam slicing through the exoskeleton like it was butter, and long, stiff tentacles slammed into his faceplate as he collided with their hurtling bodies, and he tripped on one, still firing, and felt himself fall and, in a desperate lunge to remain upright, brought a plasteel leg forward with such brutal speed that the toe of his boot tore completely through the stumbling ant's midsection. Black fluid spouted, but Felix was already gone. Slamming forward into them, firing wildly about, he had to get out of them, had to, mandibles flashing by him and at him, tree-trunk arms and legs and claws crossing in front of him. Most didn't seem to know he was there, and the few who saw and reacted were blazed down or passed by. But still there were more to come, and more still, and rows of them. He'd been dropped right into them, and the overworked blazer was signaling frantically of overheating that he swore he felt right through the goddamn plasteel, and still there were more. He must keep moving. He must, and then he was through them, and past them, and in front of him was a long dune of that sand. Without conscious thought, he leapt over it with a quick, powered leap. The dune was perhaps 3 meters high. His leap carried him perhaps half that distance above it, and he was down again, blazer ready, spinning around to cover all directions at once, but he was alone. No ants here at all. He was in what looked like a dry river bottom, and he was alone. He blinked, straightened up from his crouch, took an instinctive step back towards the way he had come. And the ants appeared. First 1, then 3, then 9, a dozen, all clambering over the dune toward him. He blazed them all, severing limbs, melting giant skulls. More came, and he blazed them too. And then more and more from each end of the dune, and he was having to swing the gun back and forth to cover them all, and it was getting to where he could just barely get the ones at the far ends. And then one vaulted at him from the center, and he ducked and flashed blazer fire, and the headless torso careened into him, and he ran. He stomped madly down the riverbed. The dune, he now saw, was a ridge of sand forming one wall of the bed. He looked for a break, thought of leaping again. But wouldn't that make him a target? Wait, was he a target now? He twisted to look back over his shoulder. Dozens of ants rushed toward him, jamming the narrow passage with their writhing, flailing legs and heavy swinging arms and huge claws. Globular eyes bored down on him. The engine Felix skidded to an unexpected stop, took careful aim, and killed them. There was no place for them to go, no cover to hide behind. They were all jammed together, all headlong urgency and targets doomed. Only when he had gotten them all, 40, 80, 200 twitching bodies, only then did he think to notice that none of them, not a one, had been armed. He stared at the remains for a moment. He had been told to expect blazers, heat rays that could, eventually, boil his suit on his back. There was nothing here. He ran on. A gap in the ridge appeared, but it was on the wrong side, back toward the ants. And he thought he should just rush past, or maybe sneak by, or maybe leap over the opposite wall. Instead, in his indecision, he ran into the open without altering his stride. It was terrible, terrible, awful, awful. Ants still. More ants still in columns and rows and marching, and they saw him and turned toward him, so many seeing and turning at once like they knew him personally and expected, and as they burst through the gap he was past it with power to kick and stride. Coming for him. That was bad, very bad. But what was worse was that sight, that terrible, terrible, awful, awful sight, that split-second sight back along their horde to where he had been, and where the others were still. The ants were swarming over the others, the dead and dying warriors. His fellows, his humans, being peeled open and apart by too many claws and pincers and mandibles snapping, plasteel shredding, and no one getting a chance to fire enough to stop the peeling, shredding, swarming mandibles with globular eyes. They were all dead or dying back there. The riverbed turned, bent to the left, and then the right, and he came to another gap, on the wrong side again, and ground to a stop, staring stunned, shocked. 6 endless rows of ants poured up from out of a squat cubic structure, sitting half buried in the sand. Those are supposed to be supply dumps. They told us they were only supply dumps. From behind him came more ants boiling around the bend, and he blazed them at first, but his blazer got immediately hot. Oh, overload. And he thought of running, and he thought of leaping out of the riverbed, and he thought of using a blaze bomb, and it was already in the air, a line drive straight into the crowd at the bend. He dropped and flattened himself, and it blew. They died, the ants. The ridge walls, narrow here, crumbled and closed the riverbed off. But the other gap. He turned, and through the new gap they were coming. So many. He threw another blaze bomb into the ranks, and it blew as he crouched, ants flying everywhere, but still more and more from the cube in the sand, globular eyes, and he aimed more carefully and missed, too much adrenaline, but the next bomb flew true with a slight arcing trajectory only meters above their heads, and down into them and right into the mouth of the cube, right on the upward sloping ramp, and blew just right. The sides of the entrance disappeared outward. The roof kicked high, lifting and opening, and then falling and shattering, and the whole damn cube collapsed on itself. Another blaze bomb over his shoulder to the other ants already out and coming, and he was off and running again. The riverbed veered to the left and left again and dropped downhill. He was accelerating, really moving now. And when he burst out into the open space beyond and accelerated even harder, to the best he had, he knew he had lost them. They couldn't keep up, and he was safe now, for now, but alone, and the only one left, and he concentrated hard on the vision of the collapsing cube, and what he could do to them instead of that other vision, the terrible, awful sight of peeling plasteel and what they could do to him. Alone on a hostile planet, Felix the scout, the soldier, the engine, the killer, ran. He ran, and ran, and ran.